At this point in his career, Jonathan Hickman needs no introduction, but he gets one anyway. His work at Marvel has been high profile, and that's what brought him to prominence. His run on the Fantastic Four was the first indication he had some refined writing skills. The Secret Wars event from 2015 solidified him as a creator capable of big ideas that are executed very well. House of X and Powers of X from 2019 once again proved that Hickman, when given some editorial latitude, is capable of delivering a tight action story with high stakes and a premise that Marvel can mine for ideas. Conceptually, it's practically flawless. And then, well, it became a mess, but that's a story for another time. His early work, which brought him to the attention of Marvel, has a very anti-corporate edge to it. Ironically, a recurring subtext is creative people facing interference, executing their ideas. One will detect this in Pax Romana, Transhuman, and the Manhattan Projects. The irony emerges when one looks at his commercial output, most of which was certainly tailored to meet the needs of editorial and the publisher. Whatever creative vision he had also had to integrate corporate demands. All of this seems to suggest Hickman is a sellout. Personally, I think it's more accurate to say he is practical. For Marvel, he does the best he can within the parameters he's given. That's what a professional does. In my opinion, it's his independent work where he serves as creative muse, and where he does his best work. At his worst, he produces honest failures that had the best intentions. Nightly news is a condemnation of journalism, or really, the lack of morals and ethics displayed by a medium that pretends to deliver necessary information. In a bygone era, reporters and journalists were concerned about facts and the impact it had on society. News then became another form of entertainment. In principle, it was never intended to be a commercial product. It was intended to inform, not to turn a profit. At some point, the prettiest, most confident face that could read a teleprompter told us the news, regardless of whether they understood what they were reading or had any perspective about it. News became a cheap product anyone could consume at any point during the day. This is what Nightly News examines and satirizes. It is, certainly, the most cynical thing Hickman has ever written. It is a pointed diatribe that also happens to be a very fine story. The miniseries could be referred to as quirky. It has some barely functional art, and it's filled with loads of infographics. At times, it's like an information overload. There's way too much going on. Hickman ensures that when he's making a point, all the data to support that point is on the page, so it gets a bit overwhelming at times. At the same time, while the artwork may have a clip art feel to it and there's a lot of supporting text, the page itself is well designed. For the most part, it's quite intuitive, and the eye travels organically across and down the page. It's hard to be too critical about Nightly News. It was Hickman's first series after all, but despite the flaws, it is a strong beginning. It contains a good plot, some good humor, a very smooth ending, and in the end, it's actually a good satire of corporate news. This is a story that can be misread as anti-religion when in fact, it's pro-science. Nowadays, choices appear binary. If someone supports one thing, it's presumed they are, naturally, completely opposed to the opposite. There is another option, one that doesn't involve compromising one's values, and that's to acknowledge the opposition, then adapt to it if circumstances require. This is what happens in Pax Romana. At its core, it explores what would happen if history was shaped to favor scientific discovery and social equality, rather than have its development stunted by religious dogma and the lack of a long-view understanding of human development. It's a premise that spends a lot of time establishing itself, and then it reaches a very abrupt conclusion. It's a very Twilight Zone ending, which isn't a bad thing, but it does read as if Hickman had explored all the pieces he was interested in, and then he wrapped it up immediately. Transhuman is an interesting documentary-style story about the rise of two competing companies that develop technology to enhance human beings. It is one part satire, like Nightly News, and one part nightmarish science, like the forthcoming Manhattan Projects. Then it adds the questionable intentions of individuals being funded by companies looking to make billions. Transhuman seems to be a subtle critique of Warren Ellis's utopian outlook on transhumanism, or anyone that advocates for a post-human society. The end results may be great if one believes humanity needs to head in that specific direction, but what about all the innovative steps and catastrophic failures that happen along the way? Also, there is the unintended, often overlooked consequence of chemically and mechanically upgrading ourselves. Doing so stagnates natural evolution. At one point, monkeys are used as test subjects, and the results are a nightmarish version of the X-Men, which is both amusing and terrifying. This development is used to foreshadow the ending, and it strengthens the argument that manipulating evolution might be a bad idea. Overall, Transhuman is a piece of work that's not as cynical and satirical as Nightly News, but it is a close second. Briefly, the story is about what's required to assure a utopia. It's a brisk tale that is done well, but it seems more like an outline as opposed to a full story. All the major beats are represented, but nothing is fleshed out in detail. And like Pax Romana, once Hickman has gotten to the point he was trying to make, the story ends abruptly. Mainly, it's a fast-paced, superhero spectacle with some very lean storytelling. The artwork by Ryan Bodenheim is simply fantastic. It's greatly enhanced by the flat, limited color palette, which makes scenes pop. There is a noticeable cinematic flair to the artwork, yet it's distinctly a comic book. It's not something that would translate or be easy to reproduce in another medium. The Red Wing is another time travel story. It's about the present fighting an enemy from the future. The conflict itself takes place throughout history, and the present is uncertain who the enemy is and what they hope to achieve. Overall, it's an environmental commentary about how the current generation is leaving the world in a terrible place for the next generation. It's a bit heavy-handed in that regard. Nick Pitera's artwork is pretty on point, and it helps to visually hold the story together. Otherwise, this is a fine short story, but it's not outstanding. It may be the weakest entry in Hickman's independent bibliography. It's an honest effort, but the message of a future generation paying for the sins of the past is a pretty tired area of exploration, and I don't think Hickman brings anything new to the argument. It reads like an acknowledgement of current concerns, and an apology for the environmental mess more than anything. Feel Better Now was intended to be the first in a series of 40-page graphic novels, and it would have been the first story Hickman wrote and illustrated since Pax Romana. In an interview with Comic Book Resources, Hickman described it as, quote, "A bunch of psychiatrists who, out of boredom, decide to begin tinkering with their patients, and what starts as immature pranks and harmless fun very quickly turns into something pretty hardcore, bleak, but hilarious, deviant behavior." Unquote. For whatever reason, this graphic novel never saw print, and it seems to be abandoned. The Manhattan Project was Hickman's first ongoing, independent series. It's an alternate history story involving all the major players responsible for developing the first atomic bomb. However, that project is a cover for more complex scientific innovations. This is a madcap adventure story using twisted versions of actual scientists. It reads like both Hickman and the artist, Nick Pitera, were having stupid amounts of fun exploring unreal, bad science leading to dangerous discoveries. Speaking of Pitera, his artwork is perfect for the tone of the series. The character designs are both cartoonish and absolutely terrifying when necessary. Some of the violence gets pretty grotesque, but it's very suitable for what the series is aiming for, which is over the top, but mostly grounded science gone completely bad. Also, Jordi Belaire's coloring is stark and perfectly meshes with Pitera's artwork. Issue 15 is pure excellence. Belaire uses red and blue to differentiate opposing factions. Yes, it's a simple choice, but such a limited set of colors is difficult to pull off in an effective, organic manner. At the same time, Pitera designs a multitude of characters, all of whom are the same person, but they all look distinct. The issue is simply insane, all the creators aligned with a synchronicity that cannot be manufactured. I would say, by issue 20, Hickman mentally taps out. It appears as if he's building towards a new story arc to propel the series forward, but then he decides otherwise. The series wraps up at that point. Although, in the final issue, Hickman mentions the series will go on hiatus and then return with more focused stories. Only one, The Sun Beyond the Stars, would ever be published. Secret is a high-octane spy thriller involving some leftover threads from the Cold War. Unfortunately, in the final issue, the story hops all over the place and comes to a slightly messy conclusion. It would be unfair to characterize it as incoherent or sloppy, but it isn't a tight package. In my opinion, there's an issue or two of material missing from the finale. Overall, I'd define this as a busy, ambitious story that doesn't quite land. God is Dead is a continuing series published by Avatar. Hickman co-wrote the first 6 issues, and it has been written by someone else since. Despite the credit, Hickman's level of involvement is unclear. In my opinion, it seems like he created the concept and perhaps wrote a plot. Otherwise, the 6 issues he's credited with co-writing read like someone else's voice. So this is a series with Hickman's name attached to it, but it doesn't seem like something he was involved with in any significant way. East of West is an apocalyptic, science fiction-based western. In many ways, it's a sprawling alternate history epic with a lot of well-managed moving parts. This was a highly collaborative project between Hickman and the artist, Nick Dragotta. According to interviews, Hickman wanted to do a western story. Dragotta was interested in doing science fiction, so both elements were combined and integrated. Furthermore, it was done in the classic Marvel style. Hickman gave Dragotta a plot for the issue, and then the artist would break it down and pencil it. Afterwards, Hickman would write the final script. Considering all that happens in the story, it's a practically seamless collaboration. The story itself is about America during the end times. The apocalypse has been foretold, the 4 horsemen have arrived, and everything is about to get messy. The heads of the 7 nations that rule America are all corrupt and devoted followers of a prophecy. They are known as the Chosen, and the horsemen ensure they stay on point and deliver the end of the world. The 4 horsemen also have their own issues. Death has decided to leave the group and find his son. That's a long, spoiler-filled plot development, so I'll skip over summarizing any more than that. To add one final complication, tensions erupt between the 7 nations, and an all-out war begins. Perhaps the best part of the story is the internal politics, alliances, and chaos that erupts between the 7 nations. There's a lot of maneuvering and manipulation, which is highly intriguing. Not to mention some very good characterizations using slightly modified versions of well-known historical figures. The 2 that stand out are Antonio LaVey, an obvious reference to Anton LaVey, and Archibald Chamberlain, a very cynical but practical version of Samuel Clemens, more popularly known as Mark Twain. Each of the 7 nations feel rather distinct, with varying degrees of power and influence. It's one very important element of the story that reads impeccably fleshed out and grounded. Together they represent one powerful nation. Separately, internal conflicts, historical grievances, and personal agendas threaten to tear it apart. It's just managed perfectly. Personally speaking, I thought it ended on a less than satisfying note. It's supposed to feel hopeful and warm, but I don't think it delivers. At least, it didn't connect with me. Your results may vary. Otherwise, it's a rather wild, entertaining ride. The Dying and the Dead was solicited as a 10-issue series, but only 6 issues were completed. Unfortunately, I could not find any solid information as to why the series was discontinued. It did experience a 2-year delay between issues 3 and 4, so that's likely an indication something behind the scenes wasn't working. Beyond that, there's nothing. Hickman described Frontier as, quote, like Star Trek, but super depressing, unquote. He would elaborate further and say, quote, Frontier is about humanity finally achieving a perfect utopian tomorrow and then having it taken away. It's about the death of future, the death of hope, and the terminal orbit of mankind. Basically, it's a book about trying to survive when you're a doomed culture, unquote. This was another comic where Hickman was responsible for the entire production, writing, artwork, colors, and lettering. In the end, it was solicited, but then cancelled. The reasons for this project never materializing are unknown, as far as I can discern. Technically, the Black Monday Murders hasn't ended, although it has hit the end of a story arc. considering it took 2 years to produce 8 issues, and there's been nothing new since 2018. It's likely this is an abandoned project. Which would be very unfortunate if that's true. Hickman built a rather solid foundation with rules, legacy, and protocol that feels true and organic. It would be a shame to see all that potential not used. The Black Monday Murders mixes magic and economics to reveal how very few people control the stock market and, inevitably, the world. It's a deep conspiracy story about money, power, and magic. If I had to predict the future, it would involve the system being dismantled and rebuilt around one key figure. The artwork by Tom Coker is perfect for the story. The tone and atmosphere it projects greatly enhances the material. It's pretty astounding how Hickman finds the right artist for the right project. Looking back, every choice seems perfect, and Coker on this series is no exception. First of all, it has to be mentioned that Mike Huddleston's artwork is amazing and varied. He's not like J.H. Williams III, who changes his style on a whim, but Huddleston does change up how the artwork looks according to the scene. It's some really fine skills on display. The story itself is about a group of female assassins who are hired to find an important religious artifact. The point of view character is a newly recruited young woman who is coerced into service and seems unsuitable for the profession. The first half of the first issue is somewhat confusing and reads like a completely different, unrelated story. It's a setup and an introduction of one of the species that will play a pivotal role. But in the moment, there's a lot going on, a bunch of information being presented, and it isn't a smooth read. Once you get past that, the actual story begins. Considering Hickman's next ongoing project, 3 Worlds, 3 Moons, Decorum reads like the inspiration that led to creating a new universe populated with alien species and alien stories. Three Worlds, 3 Moons is a Substack project that started in 2021. It's described as a brand new comic book universe, with various creators taking the concept and filling in the spaces. It's an ongoing project that I'm only adding here for a sense of completeness. Generally speaking, the independent work of Jonathan Hickman is rather solid. The 2 complete, ongoing series, The Manhattan Projects and East of West, are definitely worth reading. Of the miniseries, The Red Wing and Secret are the only 2 that are weak, in my opinion. Conceptually, both are good. Although, The Red Wing's premise is a bit tired, and the message is too heavy-handed. Secret's flaw was merely trying to wrap up events in one issue. It's interesting to note that the very early work does have a particular cynical point of view. Over time, that seems to be traded for a stripped-down, concise level of somewhat objective storytelling. Naturally, the results vary, but the work is quite consistent. Also, one of Hickman's writing quirks, the infographic, is used sparingly. In some cases, it's not used at all. The other quirk is a quick conclusion with the briefest possible epilogue. He tells a story and then doesn't linger. He gets out as soon as possible. In my opinion, Hickman is an example of a writer who doesn't write down to his audience. At the same time, he doesn't come off as someone who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He may understand some complex topics, but if he's unable to communicate those complexities, then he's just a pretentious jerk trying to show off within his fiction. As someone who also takes what appears to be a dispassionate view of a subject, I can appreciate an objective storytelling approach being misunderstood as distant, or robotic, formulaic, and lacking personality. It isn't. Hickman simply isn't preaching to you. He's problem-solving. He's creating a difficult situation, putting relevant smart characters inside that situation, and then exploring the results. He makes discoveries, not proclamations. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. And before you go, leave a like and a comment. This platform loves to ignore suggesting my content, so all those yummy engagements help out a lot and give this channel a little more visibility. I'd also like to thank all my supporters on Patreon and YouTube. I appreciate everyone who checks out my Patreon and signs up. I'm hoping that very soon I can hit a certain level of support and start producing longer or more videos. Not to mention produce some exclusive content. That's my goal this year. I'd like to say an extra special thanks to Odin Ashcroft, Phil Sagan, Corey Drew, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, Steve White, Taylor Dull, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Hey look, a playlist. Check it out for a variety of fine video products. Until next time.